How to install an AMD AM4 socket Ryzen processor. This is a 5600X, but this install procedure will work for any AM4 CPU. You will notice that when you open the box, it contains a cooler. Your model might not, but this one does, and also the CPU inside the plastic case. During this entire procedure, make sure that you are either wearing a static wristband so that you don't shock your components and kill them, or just that you're very cautious and touch a metal surface before touching each component to make sure you're grounded. I would recommend leaving the CPU in the plastic case until you're ready to install it, as the pins you can see on the bottom are very fragile and it is important not to damage them during the installation, and that includes bending them. One of the first things you're going to want to do is to download a program called CPU-Z. This program can show you precisely what motherboard and what version of BIOS it's running. This is important as you may need to update your BIOS in order to be compatible with a new CPU. Although if you're running an X570 board or B550 board, this is probably unnecessary. Nevertheless, I'm going to show you the BIOS update procedure for my board so you get a general idea. You can see here that I've downloaded my new BIOS file onto a thumb drive. I'm going to put it in the main directory of the thumb drive so that the BIOS can easily recognize it. Your BIOS upgrade may be different. See the motherboard's manufacturer site for details. They can tell you step by step how to update BIOS, other videos on YouTube also. Once you have the BIOS file on the thumb drive, you're going to want to restart your computer. As it's restarting, you want to spam the delete or F2 key to get access to the BIOS. This is an ASUS board. The best way to update this is from the Easy Flash 3 utility, which you click on. It gives you an option to do it from the internet or from storage. I find storage to be less problematic. So you can see here, the update file is on the bottom right. It's a .cap file for this motherboard on the bottom right. Again, I probably wouldn't bother with this if you have an X570 board or a B550 board. Click on the file and we tell the motherboard, yes, we would like to update this BIOS. And now it's going to proceed to do so, which takes quite a bit of time. When the BIOS is complete updating, you'll see a screen that says successful and it wants to reboot, which is good. So let it reboot, but you're also going to spam the delete key to get back into the BIOS again. You might not have to, it might prompt you to just go back into the BIOS, which this one did. Right here you can see it says press F1 to run setup because the BIOS is now changed. It's probably a good idea to find the section that says load optimized defaults in the BIOS just to set everything back to normal and then reboot again. And if your computer doesn't boot, you can go into the BIOS and check the boot priority to make sure that it's booting correctly. Option 1 should be maybe your Windows Boot Manager. The second one should be your C drive where Windows is installed, and then maybe a flash drive after that. Don't forget to take your flash drive out after you do the BIOS so the computer doesn't try and boot to the flash drive. At this point, I'm going to run something called a user benchmark to see how the computer is performing before I put in the new CPU, just as a baseline. That can be found at www.userbenchmark.com. Download the file and run it, and it'll give you how most of your gear is performing in a basic sense. I also do a 3D Mark run. This is another benchmarking software just to see how the GPU and CPU are performing in games. Again, before I go ahead and change things to find out if there's something wrong when I install the new CPU. So I have a base mark to compare everything to. Base mark, benchmark, whatever you want to call it. Finally, I bring up hardware info 64. Here's the download page if you need to install this. I use the installer version. And this will give me a good amount of information on my temperatures before I install the new CPU to make sure that when I install the new CPU, the cooler is seated correctly and it's not running too hot. So you can just write these down or mentally note them or take a screenshot, whatever you'd like. Okay, shut down your computer completely. Once the computer is shut down, disconnect all the cables in the back. I also turn off the power supply at the switch at the back. You also don't want to open up the computer case for at least 30 seconds once power is off. This lets the capacitors drain out so you don't damage components or shock yourself. Since you're going to be opening up the CPU anyway, it's a good time to take an opportunity to clean the CPU up of any dust with compressed air. Don't use too high of a setting, maybe 80 to 100 psi is fine. Don't blast directly on components. When you're doing this, put your finger on fans to make sure that they don't free spin while you're blasting them out. That way you don't damage the components. Once this is done, we can go ahead and swap out the CPU. Once you have the case open, you can start removing your CPU cooler. Mine's a liquid cooler, yours could be air. If you use a screwdriver, make sure you do not touch it to the motherboard at all. You can scratch and kill traces and make the motherboard inoperable, so use great caution when removing the cooler. You have to be really careful when you're removing this cooler from the CPU. Because of the way the AM4 socket works, sometimes the CPU can come off with the cooler. So it's very important to try and give it a little twist when you're taking it off if the CPU is stuck with the thermal paste to the cooler itself. If it does come off like this, don't panic. Just make sure that it doesn't drop off and bend the pins. Often, when the cooler is removed, you can just move it to the side. Make sure it's not leaning on any motherboard components. Mine just kind of hangs out over it, so there's no danger. But if you need to remove it all the way, go ahead and do so. You'll see that there's thermal paste on the CPU, which we need to clean. In this instance, the CPU did not get stuck to the cooler as it came off. But again, watch out for that. And if it is really stuck on there, you can, again, twist it to get it off, but be really careful of the pins. Use 91% or higher isopropyl alcohol for cleaning. You can use Q-tips or paper towels or microfiber if you got it. You want to make sure that all the paste is removed and that you don't have skin oils or anything on both the back of the cooler or the CPU itself. This is because skin oils on the cold plate or the CPU can lead to worse thermals, which we don't like. Cold equals good. Now that everything is clean, you should see a metal lever. You can pull that towards you gently and then it lifts up. So don't go towards yourself very much, just enough to release it, and then it slides up. You want to go all the way up. This isn't enough. Once you get to perpendicular, it should snap into place. If you try and remove it first, you'll feel that the CPU is locked in. That is, of course, if it didn't accidentally come out with the cooler, which can happen. When it comes out, inspect it for any bent pins. Make sure everything looks really straight. Make sure no pin snapped off and got caught in the CPU. You want to minimize the time that the socket is open to the air so that micro dust particles don't fall into it. So have your CPU ready to go in. Now there's 4 sides to this, and one of the sides is going to have a little notch. On mine, it's in the upper left. If you look at the pins on the CPU, you'll see that there's 3 diagonal ones, but one that has a square notch on the corners. You want to match the square notch to the square notch in the motherboard socket. The CPU should level easily and fall just real gently into the CPU socket without any force at all. It should just kind of slip in there super gently. Again, Make sure that you're grounded before you attempt this, and be very, very gentle seating the CPU down into the socket because you don't want to bend any pins. It should just, gravity should just make it fall in there. You can gently test that it's in the right spot, and once you're sure it is, push the lever back down into place and snap it down. And now it's in. I'm going to give the top of the CPU an extra clean because I just touched it with my hands to make sure it's really, really clean with a little more alcohol. And now it's time to put some thermal paste on the CPU. Everybody has a different opinion on how to do this. There's a million YouTube videos. You could go watch one of those. I used to just put like a pea-sized amount on the middle and let it spread out. Now I put a pea-sized amount in the middle and I kind of spread it out myself. When I took this cooler off, I had not put quite enough compound last time, so I'm trying to go a little harder this time. But you want the application to be really, really thin when the cooler seats down onto it to get the best thermal conductivity from the CPU to the cooler. So don't, underdoing it is really bad, but also way overdoing it is really bad too. So again, like a pea, the size of a pea should be enough, and you can try and spread it a little towards the edges however you like. If you're using the cooler that came with it, there should be a pre-applied paste on the cooler. You don't have to do any of this. You can just stick it on there. Now it's time to reseat your cooler onto the CPU. Be careful of not scratching the motherboard surface. Make sure the cooler seats down properly. And don't over tighten things, but it needs to be really on there. I mean, don't over tighten, but tighten. Usually as well as you can get it hand tight is pretty good if you have screws. If you have clips or whatever, don't worry about it. If you're going to use a screwdriver, be real cautious to not over tighten. And if things feel solid, it's ready to reinstall the case and go plug everything back in again. Plug everything back in, remembering to turn on the switch at the base of the power supply. Now we can turn the computer back on. It may take a while to boot the first time, but as it does, remember to spam the delete or F2 key in order to get into the BIOS so we can see if everything's going well. Again, this motherboard is saying new CPU installed, and F1 to enter a setup, which is what you want to do. And now we can see that the CPU is being recognized. And the first thing you want to check right off the bat is temperature, if you can find it in here. You want to make sure that the CPU is not overheating because it's not seated correctly to the cooler, or the cooler was unplugged. If the cooler is not contacting the CPU correctly, the CPU can overheat very rapidly within a matter of seconds. But we've got 45 degrees here. That's great. Anything under 80 is safe, but your target is, I don't know, 60 or whatever. And just to clarify, that's Celsius, not Fahrenheit. If you updated the BIOS and reset to defaults, now you need to go through and fix everything the way you had it. If you're an overclocker, or if you have a RAM XMP profile to speed up your RAM or whatever, I would probably boot the computer first just to let it figure out what it's doing before I go play with all that. So all I'm doing is saving a new profile here that's like a baseline of defaults so that I can go back to it if I need to. And you can just tell it to save changes and restart. Once the computer is up and running again, I rerun my benchmarks to make sure that everything is looking good. Here's a user benchmark run again. I run my 3D mark again, see what improvements I get, and I compare this information to the old CPU. If your performance drops, then something's wrong in your BIOS or with your cooling or something like that. You should also open up hardware info to make sure that the CPU is not overheating, and it's probably a good idea to stress test. You can stress test however you want. I usually use ASUS or Cinebench or whatever. There's a million things. Or you could just make sure you have the temps on in the background and go play games for a while and make sure things aren't overheating. That's really important. But if they're not looking bad, if the temperatures look good, then you're done.